All right, friends, let's continue our conversation about time. Now, remember, we can read time on a clock. And this is the first kind of clock we learned about this week. So, you remember the name of this clock? This kind of clock has numbers that go all around it from 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and back to 12. Do you remember the name? The name of this kind of clock is an analog clock. Everyone say analog clock. All right, and let's go over the different parts of an analog clock. So the first part we know about is the shape of the clock. What do we call the shape of a clock? It's called the face. What's it called? The face. And the face tells us the face tells us the shape of the clock. The second important part of a clock, of an analog clock, is this arrow right here, this short arrow. What do we call this short arrow? We call it the small hand. And the small hand tells us the hour. And the last important part of an analog clock is this arrow right here. What do we call this longer arrow? We call it the big hand. And what does the big hand tell us? The big hand tells us the minutes. What does the big hand tell us? The minutes. And remember, when the minute hand or the big hand points to the number 12, what do we say? We say, oh, clock. What do we say? Oh, clock. Right? So great job. So this is an analog clock. Remember this week we did lots of practice reading the time on an analog clock. So here it is written out. Here it is shown on the analog clock, and we also wrote numbers here. Today, you're going to learn about a new kind of clock. There are actually two kinds of clocks. So in our classes, we have an analog clock, and on your phones, there's a different kind of clock. A lot of you who have cell phones have a clock that's similar to this. So it looks like it's lit. A lot of the time the color is red, sometimes it's green, sometimes it's on your phones, it's usually white or black. This kind of phone is this kind of clock is called a digital clock. Everyone say digital clock. So on a digital clock, you still have numbers. You have numbers on this side. You have some numbers on the other side. And you also have these two dots, and they're called the two dots together is called a colon. Everyone say colon. Colon. So these colons separate these these numbers on this side and these numbers on the other side. The numbers on this side represent the hour. What do these numbers represent? The hour. And if these numbers represent the hour, what do you think these numbers represent? They represent the minutes. So you have hours on this side, minutes on this side, and in between, what do we call that? We call it a colon. The two dots is called a colon. And we have the digital clock. And this shape here, what do you think we call this shape of the clock? Same as an analog clock. We call it the face. So we also have a face of the digital clock. Okay? The face of your clock, your digital clock on your phones is a rectangle. That's an example. All right? So I'm going to draw and label a digital clock for us. So I got a piece of paper already started. And I'm just going to also take out my analog clock just for some help. So again, on a digital clock, you have the shape of the actual digital clock, and it's called the face. Just like on an analog clock, you have the face right here. So I'm going to point to it and write down the word face with a little happy face. Okay? And then in the digital clock, like what Mr. Junie said, you have those two dots in the middle, they're called the colon. All right, I'm gonna label that too with an arrow. Write down the word colon, C-O-L-O-N, and two dots, just like that. And then, do you remember what I said, what goes on this side? Do the minutes go here? No, the hour. The hour goes here. So what I'm gonna do is just draw a box like this. And in the box, I'm gonna write down the hour. Okay, so maybe the hour is 12, maybe the hour is 2. We'll do some practice later on. And then on the other side of the colon, on this side, I'm gonna draw another box. And what goes in this box? Not the hour, but the minutes. The minutes go on this side. Okay, so that's an example of a digital clock. And look, it's kind of like an analog clock. There are some things that are the same and some things that are different. All right, it looks like things that are the same. What things are the same between an analog clock and the digital clock? I see they both have a face. So here's the face of a digital clock, face of an analog clock. There's also something that represents the hour. So this is the hour, and then this arrow hat shows me the hour. And then there's also a place for the minutes on a digital clock. On an analog clock, this big hand represents the minutes. Now, they're still different though. An analog clock has arrows. Does this have arrows? No. And a digital clock has this. It has a colon. Does an analog clock have a colon? Nah. A digital clock also has light that shines. Does this one have light? Nah. So there's things that are the same. There are things that are different about both a digital clock and an analog clock. But both clocks tell me the time. All right, both clocks tell me the time. So they have the same purpose. They have the same job. All right, cool. So now we know a little bit more about a digital clock. Let's start reading and writing the time on a digital clock. All right, friends, so let's do some practice. We're gonna practice showing the time on a digital clock, and we're gonna use the help of an analog clock, okay? So here on an analog clock, I have the time. So first, let's figure out the time on an analog clock. What do we look at first? Do we look at the big hand or the small hand first? We look at the small hand first, and the small hand tells us the minute or the hour. Yeah, the small hand tells us the hour. So I know the hour is 2. And then let's look at the big hand next. What is the big hand pointing to? 12. So when we see the arrow pointing 12, what do we say? We say o'clock. And I think you should remember how we represent o'clock in numbers. But let's write our time on a digital clock now. So remember, here's my face, here's my colon, and I have 2 boxes. Do you remember what this box will represent on this side of the colon? It's going to represent the hour. So just to remind myself, Mr. Junior is going to write the letter H. So I know that in this box, the hour goes in here. And then what goes on this side? The minute goes on this side. So I'm just gonna write a little M to remind me that minutes go in this box. All right, so, and we know the time. On the analog clock, we know it's 2 o'clock. So now I'm gonna write that here. The hour is 2. And then the minutes is o'clock. Do you remember yesterday what numbers do we write to represent o'clock? Do we write 12? Is it 2:12? No, remember we put 0, 0, and this is how you read the time for 2 o'clock on a digital clock. 2 o'clock. So this is the time on a digital clock now. Oops, let me turn on my fan. So the time is 2 o'clock on a digital clock. This is what it should look like. It should also look like what you see on your iPhone, right? So this is the time. Let's do a little bit more practice. All right, so here we go. Mr. Junie he changed the time on his analog clock, and I want you and your families to read this on your own. And on another piece of paper, Mr. Junie drew another box, another little box to represent a digital clock. All you have to do is fill in the boxes with the right time. All right, friends? So I'm not gonna do this part. We did one together already, but I want you and your families to do this one on your own and post a picture of your work in the comments below. All right? So I'm not gonna tell you the answer, but I'm gonna help right now. All right? So first, make sure you read the time on an analog clock. So first read the small hand, then the big hand, and then fill in the boxes here. All right? And if you think that is still too easy, if you can represent the time on a digital clock and you said, oh, Mr. Junie, I need something more spicy, more challenging, then I want you to do the opposite. So Mr. Junie right now is gonna draw one more digital clock, just like this. And I'm gonna write the time on the digital clock. And what you will have to do is look at the time on the digital clock and represent that time on an analog clock. So you're gonna do the opposite. That's Mr. Junie's challenge. Mr. Junie's challenge. So I'm gonna give you the digital time now. This is the time on the digital clock. And just to make sure Mr. Junie doesn't get confused, because a lot of the time Mr. Junie does get confused, I'm gonna remind myself that this is also the spicy question. So, for Mr. Junie's challenge today, you have to take the time on the digital clock and represent that time on an analog clock when you are done solving this one here. So when you're done filling out this digital clock, move on to Mr. Junie's challenge. All right, I can't wait to see all of your work. I'm gonna be waiting in the comments below, and make sure you share your answers. All right, friends, good luck.